Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm going to do a standalone video to answer what has become one of the most common questions on my channel. The question being whether or not Satan has free will, and how the answer to that question affects the question of the Abrahamic God's existence. So let's go! This all originated in part 1 of my response to Bible Flockbox's video on 10 undeniable facts that prove God is real. So let's look at what I said that sparked so many questions.
Does God exist, or is he just an imaginary sky fairy that religious people like to believe in because it helps them cope in life?
Well, my money's on the sky fairy, but I am intellectually honest enough to admit that we can never be completely sure, unless the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe who wants us to believe in him actually does something that he knows will convince everyone to believe in him. And before you cry, but free will though, ask yourself this question. Does Satan have free will? Because if God can't make us believe in him without still allowing free will, then Satan, who definitely knows for sure that God exists, can't have free will, which means that everything Satan does is God's will. Just think about that for a moment. If everything Satan does is God's will, and Satan is the cause of all humanity's problems, then God wills humanity to have all of its problems, going right back to the initial eating of the forbidden fruit, which means that God didn't want us to have the idyllic life he set up for us. He wanted billions of people to go to hell for not believing in him after this idyllic life was ruined. Is that a God that you want to worship and thank for everything? The mistake I made in this part of the video was assuming that my audience was as familiar with apologetics as I am, not realizing that watching as many hours of apologetics videos as I do is completely abnormal.
Abby who? Abby normal. Abby normal. I'm almost sure that was the name.
So in this video, I will clarify. The common argument goes like this. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and he wants me to believe in him, then surely he knows what he could do to get me to believe in him, and he has the ability to do that. Since I do not believe in him, then either he does not exist, or he does not actually want me to believe in him. One common apologetic response to this is that God doing what he knows would convince you for sure that he exists would take away your free will, because if you knew for sure that God exists, then you wouldn't have any choice but to worship him. And he wants you to freely choose to worship him, not to be coerced into it. I am well aware that this is not the only apologetic and not every Christian thinks this way, but it is fairly common to hear. I would also like to point out that even if this is true, I think the threat of hell would count as coercion, but that's a completely different topic. So the counter-apologetic for this one is that sure knowledge of God's existence does not take away free will. You do not automatically start worshipping God just because you know for certain he exists. How do I know this? Because Satan definitely knows for sure that God exists, yet he directly opposes him. Satan's knowledge of God's existence does not cause Satan to worship God. And this leads to a whole new series of problems. If Satan has free will, then free will isn't a special feature reserved for humans. I don't think all Christians accept this, but in all the denominations I've been a part of, it was generally held that God only gave human beings free will because he didn't just want automatons worshipping him because that's the function he designed them for. He wanted beings to freely choose to worship him, which would mean that the angels, Satan included, do not have free will. This is a huge problem because it implies that God created Satan specifically to be his own antagonist. And that's aside from the other problem with this, and that's that God designed all of humanity out of boredom, and those who don't suck his dick through their miserable mortal lives are punished by being tortured for all eternity. So assuming that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was Satan, which it wasn't, but that's a whole nother video unto itself, that means that God created Satan specifically to ensure that humanity would not continue to enjoy the idyllic life that he had set up in the Garden of Eden. And if you look at the story of Eden, it becomes clear that God hadn't really set that up to be a long-term thing. Unless Adam and Eve wouldn't have had kids in the garden, which doesn't quite fit well with the command in Genesis 1:28 where they are told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. If they were to have obeyed God and not eaten the forbidden fruit, and death had never entered the world, then eventually, with all the reproduction going on and none of the death, the entire planet would be covered in layers of living animals, and the oceans would be overflowing with fish. It just wouldn't be a pretty scenario. So it looks like God did put Satan in there specifically to mess up his plan, which biblical literalists would have us believe was perfect, but with just some cursory thought, it can be shown to be incredibly short-sighted. But that would mean that God is a next-level villain. Think Barty Crouch Jr. in The Goblet of Fire. He spent all year disguised as a teacher, trying to help and protect Harry Potter, setting things in motion to ensure that Harry would ultimately win the tournament. For all intents and purposes, it looked as though he was doing his best to help nurture and protect Harry, albeit in a very eccentric way. But it turns out that at the end, he was the villain all along, ensuring that Harry would make it so that Voldemort could use his blood to be fully resurrected. This is what God looks like if Satan has no free will. God is trying to make it look like he cares for us or had special plans for us. He made this perfect little guard that would keep us safe and happy forever if only we'd obey him. But then Satan ruined it for us. Now we can't live there anymore. Satan corrupted people in the time of Noah, so poor God was forced to start over. Satan tried to get poor Job to curse God so he would die and go to hell, but Job was faithful, so the all-loving God rewarded him in the end. Satan caused the Sanhedrin to demand Jesus be crucified, so Satan is responsible for our Lord's death. Satan leads poor, helpless human beings to sin, so that they need to accept a human sacrifice in order to cleanse them, so they can be rewarded by spending time with God. But if Satan has no free will because he knows for sure that God exists, then it turns out that God is pulling all the strings in these stories, which ultimately makes God the bad guy. But back to the nice, rosy, Satan is such a meanie and poor God is trying to help us versions of these stories. These are the versions that are often told in Sunday school. If you read them directly in the Bible, however, you get a slightly different picture. For one thing, Satan isn't even mentioned in a lot of these stories. He's a character that only shows up a handful of times in the Old Testament, and even then he's not the devil that we know today. In the story of Job, Satan is not a proper noun, as it is used with a definite article, making it more of a title, the Satan. It is the Hebrew word Satan, which is often translated as the proper noun Satan, despite it being just a word which means accuser, adversary, or opponent. In fact, there are several other places in the Old Testament where the word is translated correctly, and is very obviously not talking about some angel that's trying to beat God in some sort of spiritual war, such as in the second part of 1 Samuel 29:4, where it says, "He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us, for how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here?" In this verse, the word Satan, which is translated as adversary in most versions, is referring specifically to King David. So not only is it not referring to Satan, but it's referring to someone on God's side, so clearly this word did not have any specifically evil connotation in Hebrew. So the Satan of Job wasn't necessarily an evil character. He could have just been a member of the godly court whose job it was to oppose God's plans in order to ensure that they were without fault. The testing of Job was to make sure God's policy of rewarding his faithful servants materially didn't cause them to worship God just for material gain, and served as a lesson to humanity that you should worship God even when times are hard. In fact, a good argument can be made that the character of Satan does not exist in the Bible. None of the times when Jesus' words are translated as the proper noun Satan, including when he seems to be addressing Satan directly, such as in Matthew 4:10 when Jesus said, "Begone, Satan," a better, more accurate translation would actually be, "take away a barrier." So it really looks more like Jesus was praying that God take away a barrier from him than him actually addressing an opponent. Now, I'm not sure if this applies to the non-gospel books of the New Testament, but my main point here is that the idea of an entity named Satan is a relatively new concept in Christianity, and Bible translators have had to play fast and loose with the meanings of various Greek words and Hebrew words in order to translate them as Satan or devil. I'll leave a link down below to an article on the various words translated as Satan, demon, and devil from a Christian source, christwords.com. So the more I look into it, the more it becomes apparent that the concept of Satan has been slowly evolving over the course of Judaism and Christianity, and the modern picture of Satan doesn't really fit with the narrative, so it has been retconned into these various myths of Judaism and Christianity. Different Jewish sects have actually had very differing opinions on the character of Satan, with some having him as much the same demonic character as the Christians depict, while others have him as an agent of God, sort of like a heavenly prosecutor who does wreak havoc on people, but only with God's permission and acting out God's will. But this actually fits fairly well with rabbinical tradition, as historically speaking, rabbis would only consider a text living as long as you could reinterpret it to find new meaning. So if no new meaning could be found in a text, that text would be considered dead. This tradition actually accounts fairly well for how many glaringly obvious contradictions made it into the Old Testament. Ancient rabbis weren't concerned that a literal reading of Genesis 1 contradicted a literal reading of Genesis 2, because it wasn't meant as a plain history book, it was meant to teach moral lessons. They probably would have been appalled at modern biblical literalism. In their view, biblical literalists probably would have killed the text. No new lessons to learn, just take the text at face value. But that's a bit of a rabbit trail from the original intention of this video, so to reiterate, if God cannot reveal himself to humanity in a way that every human could be certain of his existence without compromising our free will, then that means that Satan has no free will. No free will for Satan means that all the horrible things that are blamed on Satan are actually God's will. The devil made me do it becomes God made me do it using his puppet. And this would make God look like even more of a villain, even though he already looks rather villainous just by what he claims to have done himself in the Bible. In fact, I might go so far as to say that Satan is actually the good guy of the story. He's the one that encourages humans to eat from the tree of knowledge when God wants them to remain ignorant. So maybe Satan is like God's conscience, like God has a little angel and a little devil on his shoulders, and Satan is actually the angel trying to get God to do good things. And when God listens to the evil one, Satan sneaks down to earth to try and put right what God did wrong. So if you watch Dark Matter 2525's videos, that would suggest that Jeffrey is actually Satan. And as a bonus, everything I've said in this video is completely unnecessary, as I could just point out that Adam and Eve definitely knew God existed, but they chose to disobey him anyway, so clearly they had free will despite the fact that they knew for certain that God existed. But it's a bit more fun to go down the Satan trail. So that's it for this video. Now I just want to let you know that I have started a Teespring store, so you can get some Rhino merch if you so choose. Link will be in the description. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you'd like to see in there that's not in there already. Also, you can follow me on social media and support me on Patreon. See you next time!